Okay, we on mute, so let's start over. Good evening and welcome back to Trial Watch with Demetra. I am Judge D. Lit, self-proclaimed judge and and host of our night court sessions. But I had some technical delays. I just got to be quicker about restarting my computer when I see a problem instead of trying to do all what I do. But we'll get there. But we are here. We are here. Never fear. Good evening, official Lit Lane Juror, Lit Lane Jury Box Juror, Emma Renee, Living My Best Life OG, Sean P. I was giving y'all time to get ready. That's all that was. Hey, OG Woo Child, good evening. Thank you. Thank you. You got to come through with something, right? So, y'all got to get it. I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to tell y'all, but don't let me forget to tell y'all about a funny story. To those who know. Keep coming back, become familiar with us, and you'll know too, right? But for those insider folks, do not let me forget to tell y'all about this last weekend's love seat debacle. I have to tell y'all. And also, don't let me forget at the end of tonight's court session, I want to show y'all Apollo, our mascot puppy. I want to show y'all his new outfit, his first little outfit. So I'll show all that to you guys at the end of the show. Yes, it was a definite, oh Lord moment. It was a, oh my God. It was a, not again. It was like, why does this keep happening to me moment? But as y'all can see, everything okay. So tonight, I'm very excited. This is our first real flashback trial. And so the flashback trials are different from trials that's already done and we watch and we slow burn. The flashback trials are legendary trials of great notoriety. This trial is Who Shot the Sheriff? The state of Georgia versus SIDNEY Dorsey. This trial took place in 2002. And as will be the case, if I try my best to make night court truly riveting cases. Okay, so this trial has prestige, power, conspiracies. Should I say conspiracies? Abuse of power. It has a lot of moving parts. It's the sheriff, SIDNEY Dorsey, and 4 other people was involved in this hit. Okay, so apparently they're in Georgia, and we'll get all the specifics during the opening arguments. They had this judge, SIDNEY Dorsey. It was already a corrupt setup. The 4 sheriffs before SIDNEY Dorsey even got elected, the 4 sheriffs before him previously had already been caught up in corruption, already had been caught up in scandals. So it was nothing new for this department. Okay. So when SIDNEY Dorsey stepped in, he stepped right into the role of being corrupt. It's alleged that he was misusing people, had his sheriffs and deputies working on the clock for the city and also for his security agency. It's going to be stories of sexual inappropriateness, a lot. And so he stayed in office as a sheriff for a few years, and lo and behold, someone dared to challenge him. Okay. And it's the person who challenged him and upset him and took his seat, had got elected as sheriff, that it was alleged by the state of Georgia that SIDNEY Dorsey put in place a murder for hire plan to get him out of the way so he can get his rightful position back as the sheriff. Okay. So this should be very interesting. I'm going to show y'all a quick teaser for you guys who maybe didn't see it earlier. Please hit the like and be sure to join us each evening at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time.
He turned the sheriff's department into a personal chauffeuring, Happy Meal fetching, bribe-infested, scandal-ridden organization that crushed the pride and the morale of the good men and women who worked there.
People thought he was crazy, was arrogant, self-assured.
He was a little bit of a thorn in the side.
He was a renegade.
It was the first political assassination in this country in 20 years.
It was just incredibly obvious, but there was absolutely zero evidence.
I just can't even begin to describe how shocking the allegation was.
You are the lowest scumbag of the earth.
So I think this is going to be really good in getting ready. It seemed good, and I think I may have seen this. It's been done on several true crime, so you may be familiar with it or have seen it in the past. But this is the first time we're really going to see the trial. I know for myself. Good evening, Tweety. Good to see you, girl. Welcome back to the Lit Lane Jury Box. You're right on time for a legendary new trial flashback. So we're going to get started with these opening statements. First, we'll hear the prosecution, of course, and then we'll get into the defense. Without further ado, let's get that going. I hope you've been doing well, Tweety. I'm ready too. Let's see. Let me make it full screen. Okay. Sorry, Rock wants to be heard. All right. Opening statements. Who shot the sheriff?
Power. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about power. Power of the man so consumed by power that he could not and would not let it go. A man so corrupted by power that he used the office to which he was elected, Sheriff of Dekalb County, for his own personal use. A man so consumed by power that when a man announced he was going to run against him and reform the sheriff's office, and when that man won, he devised a plan to assassinate him so he could take the office back. The man that was full of corruption, that was so consumed by power, that had a reform candidate for sheriff assassinated at his direction is the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY. On December 15th of 2000, a decorated, respected, and dedicated police officer of the DeKalb County Police Department was returning home from the Georgia Public Safety Training Center, where he had graduated from Sheriff-elect Academy, but he never made it. At the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY's direction, 4 men, Patrick Cuffey, Paul Skyers, David Ramsey, and Melvin Walker, 4 men at the bottom of this chart, assassinated Derwin Brown. They carried out the defendant's order in carrying out that assassination. And on that day, the defendant took away from this life a 20-year veteran of the DeKalb County Police Department, a husband of 23 years, a father of 5, a grandfather of 6, a career public servant and reform candidate for sheriff. He was gunned down.
Oh, y'all don't kill me. Let me rewind it a little bit. Everybody acting a fool up in here. I'm missing everything. Welcome back to the Lit Lane Jury Box, Tamika and Kathy. Good to see you, ladies. We're just starting a new trial. Who shot the sheriff? Just because y'all came in 2 minutes late, I'm rewinded 1 minute back. It has nothing to do with the fact that I missed it. I am so sorry, but I had to get Rock situated.
And dedicated police officer with the DeKalb County Police Department was returning home from the Georgia Public Safety Training Center, where he had graduated from Sheriff-elect Academy, but he never made it. At the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY's direction, 4 men, Patrick Cuffey, Paul Skyers, David Ramsey, and Melvin Walker, 4 men at the bottom of this chart, assassinated Derwin Brown. they carried out the defendant's order in carrying out that assassination. And on that day, the defendant took away from this life a 20-year veteran of the Dekalb County Police Department, a husband of 23 years, a father of 5, a grandfather of 6, a career public servant and reform candidate for sheriff. He was gunned down in his house with his wife and children at home. Now, December 15th was the culmination of all of the defendant's corruption. And for you to get a clear picture of what happened, I'm going to have to take you back in time and run you through everything. I need to introduce you to some people, and I need to introduce you to some events. The defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY, was elected sheriff in 1996, a position that paid him nearly $100,000. He was born in New York City, moved down to Atlanta, and became a City of Atlanta police officer for nearly 20 years, and even worked in the homicide department before he moved on, forming a private security firm referred to as Securities Investigation Division, or SID, before running for sheriff in 1996. He is married to Sherry Dorsey, and they have one child together. That child's name is Justin, and you may also hear that child referred to as Boomer. And the defendant has 4 other children. The defendant, after leaving the Atlanta City Police Department and serving as a homicide detective, ran SID until he was elected sheriff in 1996. The evidence will be that even after he was elected sheriff, that he had a very integral and even daily role in the operations of SID. As a private security firm, SID would contract with private entities such as banks to provide armed guards and security as the need arose. They would, in theory, hire qualified and competent security guards to go and provide the security at these locations. The sheriff, SIDNEY Dorsey, once elected, began to hire these former SID security guards, and all 4 of these individuals, David Ramsey, Paul Skyers, Patrick Cuffey, and Melvin Walker, were employees of SID. And he would hire them over to the sheriff's department, whether they were qualified or not, and over the objection of his human resources department, who said these men are not qualified to serve as law enforcement officers. The 2, Patrick Cuffey and Melvin Walker, were hired immediately. David Ramsey and Paul Skyers were not hired immediately, but after the assassination plot was hatched, just a week or so after the runoff election defeat, the defendant ordered that Skyers and Ramsey be hired by the Dekalb County Sheriff's Department as part of their payoff for the assassination. Dorsey, once elected, attained an office with awesome power, and with that came awesome responsibility. The evidence will be, ladies and gentlemen, that he abused that responsibility. The sheriff answers to the people. He is a constitutionally elected officer. He does not answer to the mayor. He does not answer to the director of the county commission or chairman of the county commission. He does not answer to the attorney general or even the governor of this state. He answers only to the people. And there are 159 sheriffs in this state because there are 159 counties. And Dekalb is one of the largest. And because it's one of the largest, it has one of the largest jail facilities. The jail facility in Dekalb, in fact, is the largest jail facility east of the Mississippi River. On any given day, there can be as many as 2,800 inmates in that jail. There are as many as 750 employees, all who serve at the pleasure of the sheriff. That means that each one of these 750 people depend on that man when he was sheriff, and now Thomas Brown, for their paycheck. And the evidence will be that those people did things they shouldn't have done because they wanted their job. And the sheriff, as a constitutional officer who has the power to employ people at will, can hire and fire at will. And their jobs were at jeopardy, and they did the sheriff's bidding. Employees like Joe Murray, who would routinely pick up the sheriff's children at school. He would pick them up and take them home. take them back to the sheriff's department. He would take them to McDonald's when they were hungry, and he would take them even to Toys R Us to go shopping. He was chauffeuring these kids around and providing daycare for them at the sheriff's direction. Not only would he chauffeur the sheriff's children around and provide daycare for them, he would also go out and work for SID, Security Investigative Division, the business owned and operated by the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY. The defendant's company had a contract at a bank, and he would hire, in theory, guards to go work it. When those guards wouldn't show up, he went to his ready-made pool of replacements, people being paid by the taxpayers of Dekalb County to protect them, to work at the jail. He would send these uniformed officers wearing a uniform of the Dekalb County Sheriff's Department, like the bailiff is here today, being paid by the taxpayers of Dekalb County, and he would send them to this private entity to work for SID. And the profits from that contract at SID weren't going to the taxpayers of Dekalb County. It was going to SID, owned and operated by the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY. Well, one day, a reporter caught wind of this from a TV station in Atlanta. And he went out with his camera and he videotaped Joe Murray working security at a Fulton County bank, not even a DeKalb County bank, ladies and gentlemen, a Fulton County bank in a DeKalb County uniform working for the taxpayers of DeKalb County. And he filmed Joe Murray working there. And so Joe Murray was upset, didn't know what to do. He called back to Roy Baker, who's the administrative assistant of the sheriff, and told Lieutenant Baker, I've just been put on film working in security here in Fulton County. What am I to do? And Roy Baker said, and you'll hear about this, don't worry, we'll just dot 4 hours of your day today so it looks like you were on administrative leave, and we'll give you back 5 hours in the next pay period. And we'll tell everybody you were working this job on your own for SID. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Joe Murray was never an employee of SID. Never. Not.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Why do they have the picture of SIDNEY DORSEY? Why the picture they chose to put on display looked like a 1987 album cover? They got jokes, okay? I just had to point that out in case y'all missed it. Let's continue.
Once did he ever draw a paycheck from SID? Not one time. Every time he worked for SID, he was on the clock for the DeKalb taxpayers, supposed to be providing public safety for them, in uniform, driving a DeKalb County car, working for SID, the profits of which went to SID. Well, Joe Murray was videotaped doing this. The news media came out with the story that he was on duty for SID, and Joe Murray was confronted by his children and wanted to set the record straight. Joe Murray will tell you that he didn't want to be perceived by his children as being dishonest. So he granted an interview to the television reporter and went on camera saying he was in fact an employee of the sheriff's department, which he was. And he told the truth. And he will tell you he told the news media this because he didn't want his children to think he was dishonest. Well, the sheriff didn't know this. And in the meantime, the sheriff being the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY. And in the meantime, a GBI agent and a district attorney's office investigator went to the sheriff's department and asked the sheriff, SIDNEY DORSEY, the defendant, who was in office at the time, why Joe Murray was there working. And the defendant said, well, he was on leave. He was working for SID. And then when confronted with the interview that Murray did, he said, well, that's against policy. I don't know anything about it. And after that interview was over, he summons Joe Murray into his office and transferred him out of the community relations department where he had worked, serving as chauffeur, daycare provider, and general running around errand person for the defendant for several years, and transferred him to the jail, yelling at him, telling him, I don't ever want to see you on this side of the jail facility again. I mentioned to you Roy Baker and told you that he was part of the ruse in covering up the timesheets. Well, Roy Baker was Sheriff SIDNEY DORSEY's administrative assistant. He was his lieutenant. and you will learn that the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department is a paramilitary organization. In other words, it has rank, it has structure. The top, you've got the sheriff. And then beneath the sheriff, you've got people of different rank. You've got captains, you've got majors, you've got lieutenants, you've got all the way down to the line officers. And generally speaking, if the major tells a captain what to do or the lieutenant tells a sergeant what to do, it gets carried out. Because if you get an order from a higher ranking officer, you have to obey that order. There's one exception. That exception is Roy Baker. Roy Baker served as the assistant to the sheriff, and you will hear testimony from the witnesses who worked in the sheriff's department that will tell you when Roy Baker gave an order, it was an order of the sheriff. He was the sheriff's mouthpiece. The order that came out of Roy Baker's mouth was as if the sheriff had spoken it to that person. Roy, a lieutenant, could order captains and majors what to do. So when these employees heard something from Roy, it was as if they heard it from the sheriff himself. Now, the defendant's two sons were not the only two being chauffeured around back and forth by the defendant's employees. He had two daughters. He had one in school in Statesboro, Georgia, and he had one in school up in Tennessee. And he would have on-duty deputies being paid by the taxpayers of DeKalb County to provide law enforcement service for DeKalb County, to drive his daughter to school in Statesboro and drop her off, or drive down there and pick her up and bring her back. And he would do the same thing with his daughter that went to school in Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, you will also incredibly hear about an incident when the girl who went to school in Tennessee's car was locked and she couldn't get into it. So instead of calling a local locksmith, she calls Daddy Sidney. And Daddy sends a deputy sheriff detention officer who is also the motor maintenance officer employed by the taxpayers of DeKalb County to drive all the way up to Tennessee to try to unlock that car for his daughter. On several other occasions, the car became in disrepair and they needed some repairs done, and he would send two officers up. One to try to repair it, and then the other one to drive the car back to Atlanta where they could fix it, and the other one would have to drive a county vehicle back that they went up in. Now, his daughters weren't the only two that got this chauffeur service. His wife and children, when they needed to go to Durham, North Carolina, were chauffeured up by a deputy with another deputy trailing in a county car, so that when the deputy driving the family in their Lexus got dropped off in Durham, North Carolina, the deputy in the county vehicle being driven while he's on the clock, and the other fellow on the clock too, could be driven back. And to top it off, the taxpayers even bought the gas for the county vehicle going both ways. Of course, they bought it going to Tennessee and Statesboro as well, and all of these other chauffeuring trips. Not only did it extend there, but the defendant wanted to take a trip in 1998 for Thanksgiving up to New York City to go back and visit family where he's from. So he calls a deputy, gets in a county vehicle, a Ford Excursion, and loads the whole family up, and has this deputy drive him and his family all the way to New York City, has the deputy wait there during Thanksgiving holidays, and then drives him all the way back to Atlanta. And if that weren't enough, in April of 2000, he loads the whole family up in a Winnebago and says to another deputy, come on over here and drive me down to Disney World. Me and my family want to go to Disney World, and we need somebody to drive us. Notwithstanding that there were licensed capable drivers in the family that could have driven. And I suspect you may hear they were for protection. But ladies and gentlemen, there is no evidence of that. They were unarmed in some instances, unqualified to carry firearms. And I suspect if they argue that it was for protection, it's just to cover up what it was, theft from the people of DeKalb County. Now, the corruption went much further than utilizing public employees to fulfill private chauffeuring and daycare needs. It involved bribery. And you will see that with the defendant's dealings with bonding companies. The sheriff of each county has exclusive control over bonding companies. That means that the sheriff can say, you can be a bonding company, or you can be a bonding company, or you can't be a bonding company. Bonding companies they have the potential to make a lot of money. And the sheriff, with that power, can turn that money on or off, just like turning water off at the sink. Shirley McMichael wanted to have a bonding company in DeKalb County. She met with SIDNEY Dorsey. An agreement was reached, and Speedy Bonding Company was born. Ms. McMichael went from making $20,000 a year as a bounty hunter for a bonding company to making over $100,000 a year as the president of Speedy Bonding Company. Shortly after Ms. McMichael began operating Speedy Bonding Company, the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY, began extorting sex from her, began demanding that she give him sexual relations in order to keep the bonding company going. Remembering now, he has exclusive authority over bonding companies, can turn it on or off like a faucet. Ms. McMichael had a young child. She was a single mother. This was her only source of income. She did not want to do this, yet she did not want to lose her company. So she was involved with the defendant for some period of time. And if this were not bad enough, if extorting sex out of her was not bad enough, the defendant began demanding cash payments. He began making her pay him off to keep the bonding company going. On one occasion, she gave him a check for $2,500. He angrily tore that up and said, "You know I only take cash." He would not accept her check. He did not want to leave a paper trail. Ms. McMichael came to the district attorney's office because she knew that there was an ongoing investigation of the corruption in the Dekalb County Sheriff's Department. She knew that, and she came to him prior to the arrest of the defendant. And she said that, "I will agree to wear a wire and go meet with SIDNEY DORSEY." And she did that. Now remember, the defendant is a former law enforcement officer, former homicide detective, so the place he picked was a noisy and crowded restaurant. And you'll hear testimony, it's very difficult for listening devices to pick up what is said in a noisy and crowded restaurant. But we had an investigator from the DA's office in the restaurant to observe what took place. And we had an investigator with the DA's office and a GBI agent outside in the car listening to the recording device. And Ms. McMichael went into a restaurant there in Decatur, O'Charlie's, and met with the defendant. She had children with her, he had children with him. And after the food order was taken, the defendant took the kids over to the area where the video games were, and Ms. McMichael and the defendant had a private conversation one-on-one. In the first conversation, the first thing that was said by Ms. McMichael is, "What do I tell the district attorney's office when they ask me about the money?" And the defendant didn't say, "What money?" Didn't say, "I don't know what you're talking about." The defendant took a napkin and wrote on the napkin, "Are you wired?" That was his response to, "What do I tell the district attorney's office when they ask me about the money?" He wrote, "Are you wired?" and hands it to her. This made Ms. McMichael uncomfortable. She thought that she was found out. She was nervous. She didn't give a reaction that the defendant wanted that was comforting to him, so he didn't have any more conversations about that. He took the napkin back. The agent that was in O'Charlie's and witnessed this will tell you that he clearly saw the defendant take a napkin, write something on it, hand it to Ms. McMichael, and take it back. And the two that were listening on the listening bug out in the parking lot will tell you that they clearly heard Ms. McMichael say, "What do you want me to do when they ask me about the money?" Now, you will also hear from members of the Major Fugitive Felony Squad. And I've gone over a few areas of this corruption. It may be easier if I jot a few of them down so you can keep them straight.
Guilty as charged. Y'all can go home now.
It's really not that complicated. But I want to put a few things down on this easel so that you can remember. The defendant, and I use a triangle to indicate defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY, used resources of the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office for family members, and you'll see girlfriends. I DCSO stands for Dekalb County Sheriff's Office, for family, in the first place he did this, which we've already talked about, is SID, Securities Investigative Division, owned and operated by him, when he would send his deputies that were being paid by the taxpayers to do that function. The second area that I just got through talking about was when the uniformed deputies would perform chauffeuring, daycare, and car repair. And I'm getting into the third area now. The third area, and you will hear from members of his major fugitive felony squad, whose job it was and is in the Sheriff's Department to apprehend serious violent felons. Their job was being diverted by the sheriff, SIDNEY DORSEY, to perform personal requests of Shirley McMichael. You'll hear about two types of warrants that are issued by judges. One being criminal warrants. When someone goes out and commits a crime, the investigators will identify who did it. They will take that evidence to a judge, and if it's sufficient, the judge will issue a warrant. The second is if that person makes bond, and I'll explain bond to you in a minute. If that person makes a bond, then the judge will set a time and date for them to come to court. And if they do not come to court, the court will issue what's called a failure to appear or bench warrant. The members of the major felony squad there at the DeKalb County Sheriff's Office will tell you prior to the defendant SIDNEY DORSEY taking office, it was never their responsibility to work with or assist bonding companies in apprehending those who did not appear in court that were out on bond by bonding companies. And what is bond? The evidence will be, ladies and gentlemen, that if you're charged with a crime, there are three ways to post bond: a cash bond, a property bond, or a bonding company. In other words, if you're charged with forgery and the judge sets a $5,000 bond, if you've got $5,000, you can remit that to the Sheriff's Department and they will let you out as surety that you'll return. And if you don't come back, the $5,000 is gone. Doesn't mean you get out of the charge. You still have to come to court, but your $5,000 is gone. Same thing with a property bond. If you don't have $5,000, you can pledge your house. And if your house is worth more than $5,000, then that'll serve as surety. But if you have neither, and the evidence will be that there's a significant number of people who seek out bonds that don't, they will go to a bonding company. A bonding company like Ms. McMichael, Speedy Bonding Company, and they will pledge 10 or 12% of it up front. And we'll use 10% because that's easy to do the math. The person who committed the offense will give Ms. McMichael or a bonding company $500, and the person will be free to go. If that person doesn't show up in court, Speedy Bonding Company now is on the hook to the court for $4,500. Obviously, if the bonds are higher, say $100,000, the bonding company, first of all, makes more money because they're going to make a $10,000 percentage on writing the bond, and they're on the hook for a lot more at the end if the person fails to appear. The evidence will be that the bonding company keeps as profit that 10%. In other words, on a $5,000 bond, the bonding company is going to make $500. If that person comes to court, then that's pure profit. On a $100,000 bond, they're going to make $10,000. If the person comes to court, that's pure profit. The trick in where they lose money is when people don't go to court. And when people don't go to court, then they have to hire bounty hunters. Ms. McMichael, in fact, used to be a bounty hunter herself. And they will go out and look for these people, because if they don't find the people within a specified period of time, the court will order the bonding company to pay the remainder of the bond.
Okay, so I feel it necessary to cut in right here, and I don't think I said this, but obviously, as you can tell, they tried him on two parts. They tried him for the misconduct and the abuses, right? And they're also trying him, along with that, for the murder for hire. Okay, that's why they're going so in depth about his his abuse of power as a sheriff. So they trying it on 2 deals, and they actually did it as a what they call that pyramid thing they do for jail. But what they call that thing? Y'all tell me when they do all of them all together, like they did Young Thug. Yeah.
And that can be quite expensive. Now remember, it's the bonding company's responsibility to go out and find these people. Now, if it's somebody dangerous and the sheriff's office knows where they is or comes across them, they'll arrest them, but it's not their responsibility anymore. Their responsibility is to go out, at least the major felony fugitive squad, is to go out and find major felons, armed robbers, murderers, rapists, child molesters, people that are out there that are a danger to the citizens, that are a public safety. That's their job, to go out and do that. Not to go look for people, especially people that are nonviolent, who've skipped out on a bond. But that changed with SIDNEY Dorsey. And that changed with respect to one bonding company. You guessed it, Speedy Bonding Company, owned by Shirley McMichael, from whom the defendant was extorting sex and money. Remember now, the defendant, SIDNEY Dorsey, was getting his cut of the profits of Speedy. So it behooved him to have his people working. His people employed by the taxpayers of Dekalb County, not by Speedy Bonding Company, the profits of which did not go to the Dekalb County taxpayers. You will not only hear about the defendant prioritizing Speedy bonds, you will hear in one instance where Ms. McMichael was not satisfied with the work that one of those investigators was doing. So dissatisfied that she got that investigator reassigned and another investigator assigned to that case to work her bond. Now, this is a private individual directing through the defendant where investigators who are supposed to be looking for major fugitives and felons, how they do their work. Well, let's put that one up there. That would be number 3. Major felony squad. Well, it didn't take long for the defendant to move on from procuring people to work at SID for him, from having chauffeuring, daycaring, and car repair needs met, and from diverting the resources of the major felony squad. He needed his own private lawyer to handle his family's and his girlfriend's legal needs. So what did he do? He went out and hired Ron Ramsey. Ron Ramsey doesn't work for the Sheriff's Department anymore. He's now an attorney in Stone Mountain and a part-time municipal court judge. And Ron Ramsey will come down here and tell you that very shortly after he became employed by the Sheriff of Dekalb County, first as a detention officer because there wasn't a position of attorney, the defendant then got the county commission to create this director of legal relations and labor relations. He didn't have it at the time, but he fit him in a position as detention officer because he needed a lawyer. And very shortly after that, he wanted Ron Ramsey to review a contract for SID, the defendant's private company. He didn't pay him for this. Mr. Ramsey was already being paid by the taxpayers of DeKalb County. SIDNEY Dorsey didn't pay him for this. Not long after that, the defendant ordered Ron Ramsey to appear in recorder's court in DeKalb County, which is traffic court, because he wanted Ron Ramsey, the defendant wanted Ron Ramsey to represent a new employee of the Sheriff's Department, Sarisa Beasley, on a speeding ticket, a violation of the laws of the state of Georgia. Ramsey, employed by the Sheriff's Department, a law enforcement agency, went to recorder's court at the sheriff's direction to represent this newly hired employee, Ms. Beasley, for her speeding ticket. What Ramsey didn't know, and what you will know, is that the sheriff was having a sexual relation with Ms. Beasley as well.
I knew he was going to say that. I figured that.
Involved Ron Ramsey being sent down to Henry County, a county south of Atlanta, because Ms. Beasley had gotten into a conflict with her husband and caused some damage to her husband's car. So she had potential criminal charges pending against her in Henry County. So the defendant sent Ron Ramsey who was being paid by the taxpayers of Dekalb County to provide legal service to Dekalb County, to Henry County, to represent his girlfriend, his paramour, the woman he was having sex with, who he worked she worked for him, down to Henry County to represent her in that matter. Well, as you can imagine, it wasn't long before Dorsey asked him to represent Ms. Beasley in her divorce. Ms. Beasley's divorce wasn't the only one that the defendant ordered Ron Ramsey to handle either. He had a nephew that worked at the jail as a detention officer, Aaron Blakeney. And Mr. Blakeney wanted a divorce too. And rather than go to the Yellow Pages and find a lawyer, go out and hire a lawyer of his own, he went up to Uncle Sidney, the sheriff, and said, "Sheriff, I need a lawyer." And the sheriff said, "Well, here, we can just use Ron Ramsey. The taxpayers already paid him. Mr. Ramsey, you represent my nephew as well." And Ron Ramsey will tell you that he had meetings with Aaron Blakeney in his office while both of them were employed by the sheriff's department. Both of them were on duty, working for the taxpayers, talking about Mr. Blakeney's divorce. And Mr. Ramsey was ordered to represent him as well. The evidence will be that the office of sheriff, and let me add legal services up there. The evidence will be that the office of sheriff had tremendous power, and the defendant abused that power. And one of the many who felt that way is Derwin Brown. Derwin Brown announced he was going to run for sheriff and clean up the corruption in the sheriff's office, the corruption that I've just told you about, sending guards and deputies who were on duty with the Dekalb County to work SID jobs for the defendant, chauffeuring, providing daycare, car repair, major felony fugitive squad resources being diverted away from apprehending serious violent felons and looking for people for speedy and legal services. All of this is the corruption. It's a big indictment, and you'll have it out with you, but this is what it boils down to, ladies and gentlemen. It's easy. This is what it boils down to. And that's what Derwin Brown wanted to clean up. The race was a bitter one. Throughout the campaign, Brown pledged that he would clean up the corruption and turn that agency, the Dekalb County Sheriff's Office, into a law enforcement agency like it should be, rather than the law-breaking agency that it was. The defendant, Dorsey, despised Derwin Brown. He despised him because he could take away his power if he won the election. On one occasion, and these are the defendant's words, not mine, the defendant referred to Derwin Brown as the lowest son of a bitch and lowest scumbag I have ever seen in my life. He despised Derwin Brown. Derwin Brown was a real threat. Before the primary election, the media had not yet exposed all of this corruption. The defendant almost won that election, but a runoff was forced between the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY, and Derwin Brown. As the runoff progressed, the media began getting out all of this corruption. The momentum turned, and Sheriff-elect Brown easily defeated SIDNEY DORSEY. There was no opposition in the general election, so by the end of the runoff, Derwin Brown was going to be the next sheriff of Dekalb County. There were some months between the runoff in January when SIDNEY DORSEY would have to turn over this power, and he did not want to do that. He didn't want to lose the position of sheriff with all of its trappings and power, with his ability to call on resources to fill his employment needs for SID. He didn't want to lose his chauffeuring, his daycare, and his car repair service. He didn't want to lose the money that he was getting from Speedy Bonding Company and the sex that he was getting from Shirley McMichael, and his ability to capitalize on the money by having major felony fugitive investigators go out and locate these people. And he didn't want to lose his free legal service. So he hatched a plan to assassinate Derwin Brown. Why would he do this? Why would he do this? He had already lost the election. What would he gain? Well, Derwin Brown, once he was assassinated, as he was, a special election was held and a new sheriff elected.
Me. Welcome back.
At that time, the evidence will be that the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY, wanted to enter that election and run for the position and get his power back. The defendant called Patrick Cuffey over to his house. This person right here. Patrick Cuffey had known the defendant since Patrick Cuffey was in high school, and the defendant was a school resource officer at the school where Patrick went to school. He will tell you he looked to the defendant as a father figure. He was very close to the defendant, and the defendant hired him at SID, as I've told you. And then when he was elected in 1996, the defendant hired Patrick Cuffey to be a deputy sheriff. He was far from a model deputy sheriff. He will even tell you. He should have been fired many times. He was an awful employee, and the defendant protected him. The defendant protected him because he knew he'd need him one day. The defendant protected him despite human resources and other superior officers of Patrick Cuffey saying this guy needs to go. Patrick Cuffey was making somewhere in the neighborhood of $45,000 a year as a deputy, which was at the very high end of what deputies would be making, and he brought him in at the high end because he was his friend, because he was his confidant, because it was him that he turned to when he needed dirty deeds done. And one such dirty deed was a spy. He wanted a spy, the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY. So he staged a firing of Patrick Cuffey. He told everybody that Patrick Cuffey was fired, and Patrick went off. And at the defendant's direction, and you'll have evidence of this, Patrick Cuffey wore a recording device. And he went and he met with employees of the defendant and political opponents of the defendant. And he would take those conversations unbeknownst to those people. He was doing that to test the loyalty of the employees at SIDNEY DORSEY's direction, and to find out from the political opponents what their intent were, what they wanted to do. He was spying for SIDNEY DORSEY. Well, how do we know this? Because 2 weeks later, after the mission was over, Cuffey was hired back. And the chief deputy at the time, Dana Scott, who will come in and testify to you, will tell you that the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY, told her that it was just a ruse, that Cuffey was on special assignment, and that he would be rehired. Well, what else do we know? We know that the defendant himself, Dorsey, had to author 2 letters to post the Peace Officer Standard and Training Committee, which oversees the certification of all law enforcement officers. He had to author and sign his name to, which you will see, which will be in evidence, explanations of Cuffey's firing, because he wasn't fired. And Post, as a result of the firing, they thought it was a legitimate firing, wanted to decertify Cuffey, wanted to take away his law enforcement privileges, wanted him not to be a law enforcement officer in this state. So Dorsey had to write to them and tell them, no, we want Mr. Cuffey to be a law enforcement officer. That really wasn't a firing, it was a suspension. And when that letter wasn't good enough, he had to send another letter backing up even further to try to save Cuffey and to save his job and to save his certification. Cuffey, who I told you was hired at $45,000 to $50,000 a year, despite doing all of the bad things that his superior officers will tell you, Dorsey allowed him to make in overtime a total salary of nearly $92,000 a year just to be the defendant's spy and carry out his wishes. Shortly after the election, as I mentioned, Dorsey hatched the plan to kill Derwin Brown so he could retake the office. He called Patrick Cuffey to his house and he handed him a note. And that note said, "Kill Derwin Brown." They sat there for hours and discussed how to do it. They discussed the fact that Dorsey couldn't be involved because everyone would think he had something to do with it. He needed an ironclad alibi, so he couldn't do it. And he told Cuffey to enlist the help of David Ramsey, Paul Skyers, and Melvin Walker. Well, actually, he kind of left it up to Cuffey, and that's what Cuffey did at the defendant's direction. And Cuffey got Ramsey and Walker and Skyers. Cuffey, you'll learn, is from the Virgin Islands. Some of these others are from the islands. Cuffey was a former Marine. Some of these others were Marines. There were bonds between them that made them natural choices. Of course, the most natural choice was they were willing to commit murder and violate the law. They were willing to do this because Cuffey, of course, wanted his job back. Derwin Brown, when elected, had sent letters to deputies employed by Dorsey saying, come January 1, y'all don't have a job anymore. Cuffey wasn't going to have a job. Skyers and Ramsey didn't have a job yet. But upon their willingness to work with Cuffey and Walker at Dorsey's direction, they were going to be hired, even though the Human Resources Department told Dorsey they're not qualified. They don't need to be law enforcement officers. They don't need to wear the badge. They don't need to be out there protecting the laws. They are law breakers, not law enforcers. How do we know that the defendant ordered this? Because you will hear from Patrick Cuffey. He will tell you what happened. He will tell you, you'll hear it out of his mouth, the whole plot. And you'll hear from some of the others that were involved. And you'll see evidence. But how do we know? How can we believe Patrick Cuffey, and how do we know Sidney Dorsey ordered this? Because Dorsey himself, prior to the assassination, confided in two people other than these four. He confided in Clarence Mosley. Clarence Mosley is an older gentleman who the defendant, Dorsey, hired to be his chief deputy when he was elected in 1996. Clarence Mosley ran the defendant's campaign. He was his campaign manager. He was an older gentleman, a trusted confidant. He had been the assistant city manager in Philadelphia. He'd had a lot of experience in government, and Dorsey trusted him. He made him his chief deputy when he was elected. And Clarence Mosley, after the election, went into Dorsey's office to tell him he was sorry about the loss. And Dorsey looked up at him and said, Brown will not take office, and I will win in a special election. Brown will not take office, and I will win in a special election. This was prior to the assassination of Derwin Brown. The words out of the defendant, Sidney Dorsey's mouth. Well, Mosley didn't know what to make of this. He kind of scratched his head, and the phone rang. And the testimony will be that the defendant got on the phone and started talking to somebody, and Mosley just walked out of the office, never to question him anymore about it. Never thought again about that statement until he was in his car and he heard on the radio that Derwin Brown had been assassinated. He told someone else. He told Shirley McMichael, the woman with whom he was having a sexual relation, the woman with whom that was paying him off to let her run the bonding company, Speedy Bonding Company, the woman with whom he was sharing the profits of that company illegally. Of course he trusted her. They were committing this crime together. He could, of course, trust her. They were together, and he told her that Derwin Brown will not be alive to take office, and I will win in a special election. And she will testify to that. Of course, they were together, and there was no one else there. There were no other distractions, and she, too, wondered what in the world he meant by this. And she said, well, what do you mean he won't be around? And the defendant, Sidney Dorsey, formed a gun with his finger, put it to his head, and pulled the trigger. Both of those conversations were prior to December 15th, 2000. What else did the defendant Sidney Dorsey do that makes us know he planned this, and he planned it to regain his power? What makes us know this? He went to several ministers in Dekalb County that were influential in the political community. He went to them after the assassination and told them, and they will testify, that he was considering running for sheriff in a special election, and he wanted their support. Would they support him? So we know that he wanted to get back into power. Another incident that reinforces that the defendant knew about the assassination plot, not only knew, directed it, and that these four individuals were going to carry out the defendant's bidding, occurred on September 22nd of 2000. September 22nd, after Dorsey had been defeated by Derwin Brown, a school resource officer at the Glen Haven Elementary School, which is located right here where this number 2 is, went to that school in order to investigate a rash of school burglaries. He and other detectives, the Dekalb County school system has its own police force for school officers, and they went there to find out who was breaking into the school. And as they pulled into the parking lot here on September 22nd, they observed a marked police car with the Dekalb County Sheriff's Office on it. And they knew that anyone that was going to come and burglarize the school wasn't going to do it while the police car was sitting there. So they waited around a little while for the police car, hopefully to leave. No one was in it, and it didn't, so they left. And they returned back again the next night, September 23rd. September 23rd, the same car was there, and no one was there again. But fortunately, a few minutes later, drives up a small car with 3 individuals. And out of that car gets a man dressed in all black. The man that got out of that car is Patrick Cuffey. The detective was suspicious and walked up to Cuffey and said, "I need to know who you are. I need some identification." And Cuffey didn't have any identification on him. He was dressed in all black from head to toe. And that was very suspicious. And he couldn't produce any identification for the school detective. But he pulled out his cell phone and he said, "Hold on," and called the defendant, SIDNEY DORSEY. The school detective had worked with Dorsey and recognized his voice and knew Dorsey. And so Cuffey handed the phone to the school detective, and the school detective on September 23rd, prior to the assassination on December 15th, was told by the defendant, "Cuffey's okay, he works for me, he's on assignment with me." The detective thought that was strange because the Dekalb County Sheriff's Office has no business at schools at night. But upon the word of the defendant, the detective let him go. And he didn't identify the other 2 individuals in the vehicle that night who, unfortunately, had he done so, would have found out that they were David Ramsey and Paul Skyers, were the other 2 individuals. And what were they doing? Why were they over here at the Glen Haven Elementary School? Well, you see, Derwin Brown lived right here with his family, where the number 1 is. Derwin Brown lived less than a mile away. Derwin Brown lived with his family in this 3rd house right here. Here's a little better view. You'll see this is the blow up of where we were. Derwin Brown lived in this house right here. And what the co-conspirators would do is park a car here, all pile into one car, drive down Red Wing Circle, come down Agapey Drive, and come down here where there was a church parking lot. And it was secluded. There was another church here and some other commercial buildings, but no houses down Agapey Way, none to speak of. There may have been 1 or 2, but this was a very secluded drive. And they would come down here and park, and you can see this tree line here gave them cover from their car being seen by anyone down on the road where Mr. Brown lived. And once they got their car parked, either up here or down here somewhere, they would come through the woods, and they would come to this first house, which was a vacant house. No one lived there. And then the second house was occupied, a family lived there, and then the 3rd house was the Brown house. And they would sit there in the shadows time after time and watch and wait and try to learn Derwin Brown's routine so that they could carry out their plan of assassination. And they would do that. And that's what they were doing on September 22nd. And that's what they were doing on September 23rd. They were down here doing that, and they went back. Remember now, the defendant himself said Cuffey's okay. Cuffey dressed in all black, less than a mile away from this man's house. Well, that incident, of course, spooked the group. And they called off all surveillance for about a month. Didn't want to go over there, thought they might have been found out. But then the year end was approaching, and at the year end and at the beginning of the new year, the power was going to change. The power would leave Sidney Dorsey, and the power would rest with Derwin Brown. Derwin Brown had already gone on record as saying he was going to do a full investigation of the corruption and turn it over to the district attorney's office. I'm sure that concerned Sidney Dorsey, but he didn't want to lose his power. He didn't want to lose his power. With the year end approaching, the defendant had to give the execution order, and he told him to go and take care of it. On December 15th, a cold and rainy night, the 4 co-conspirators, acting at the defendant's, the 5th co-conspirator, right here, Sidney Dorsey's direction, went back to that wooded area, went back to that vacant house and waited for Derwin Brown's return. For Derwin Brown, it had been a happy day. He had been down in Forsyth, Georgia, the home of the Georgia Public Safety Training Center, where he had graduated from Sheriff-elect school. He had come back and stopped at a local outlet mall to buy some Christmas presents for his children. And then he had gone to a restaurant where he had celebrated with some friends that wished him well. His wife was with him. Some of his family members were with him. And he stayed on at the restaurant for a half hour or so after his wife and children left before he came home. Shortly after 11, he left the restaurant, drove down the street to the house that you saw, parked here on the street because there were cars in the driveway. But he didn't see Ramsey, Cuffey, and Walker, 3 men who laid in wait for him. Skyers was in his vehicle waiting on them. He was the wheelman. Walker was armed with this, a Tech 9 semi-automatic handgun, a formidable weapon. Ramsey had a .380 smaller gun. Cuffey had a 9mm handgun. Ramsey and Cuffey's job were to serve as backup. If this gun malfunctioned, which this is a replica, this isn't the exact gun, this is what it would look like. We weren't able to recover the whole gun. We recovered parts of it, and you'll see those parts. But had this gun malfunctioned, Cuffey had a 9mm fully loaded, and Ramsey had a .380 fully loaded, ready to carry out the defendant's assassination order. Unfortunately, the gun did its job. As Derwin Brown got out of his car with his raincoat on, Christmas presents in one hand, and a dozen roses in the other. For you see, December 15th wasn't only his graduation day, it was his wife's birthday. And he was carrying roses home to her. He was walking down the driveway. His son was at the window. His son turned and wasn't at the window, thankfully, when it happened. Ramsey, Cuffey, and Walker all came out of the darkness, guns blazing. That gun, a gun just like that one, blazing. The 9mm and .380 didn't have to be fired because the Tech 9 did its job. Derwin Brown, a career public servant, father of 5, grandfather of 6, reformed candidate for sheriff, a good man, was gunned down in his driveway. More than 10 shots riddled his body, with his wife and children there at home. Skyers waited for Ramsey, Cuffey, and Walker to come running back to them. They jumped in the car and made a hasty getaway. Things were so confused and rushed that in the run from the Brown house to the car, David Ramsey dropped his .380. They got back to Cuffey's house and they grouped up, made plans how to destroy the evidence, how to get rid of the gun, how to get rid of the clothes they were wearing. And they parted ways. Skyers was supposed to get rid of part of the gun, so he took his part of the gun to different locations, threw part of it in a storm drainage gutter, threw part of it in a dumpster. Ramsey was supposed to get rid of Walker was supposed to get rid of the barrel. No, Ramsey was supposed to get rid of the barrel. So he took the barrel, and unfortunately it was never found. And later in the evening, Cuffey and Ramsey decided that they needed to go back and look for that .380. They needed to go back and look for the .380 because Cuffey had borrowed it from a deputy sheriff there at the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department, and he felt like if it were found out there, that it would be traced back to them. Now the .380, they believe, was dropped over here in the wooded area somewhere, between running from the house and getting back in the car, somewhere in this wooded area. So after the four co-conspirators formulated their plan, how to get rid of the evidence, how to get rid of the clothes, and Ramsey and Cuffey decided they wanted to go back and look for the gun. Well, the corruption investigation had been going on since June of 2000. And the first two suspects in the assassination of Derwin Brown were SIDNEY DORSEY and Patrick Cuffey. And immediately, police put tails on both of these individuals. And you will hear testimony that despite Patrick Cuffey's initial statement to the police that he was at home all night, police observed Patrick Cuffey and another person who we now know as David Ramsey leaving his house at approximately 3:30 in the morning and driving around, heading over towards the Brown residence. There was some erratic driving, and the police thought they might have been seen, so they dropped off the tail. Later, Ramsey got out of the car and tried to go back to the location, but there was too much police presence, and so they had to scrap the idea. And in the interim, Cuffey went to a friend's house and stayed with her for several hours before getting a cell phone call from Ramsey and going back and picking him up. You also hear evidence that later, these individuals went to Radio Shack and purchased a metal detector and tried to go out there, David Ramsey did, to try to find that gun because he didn't want that gun linking him to this murder. And we can prove that he did that. Unfortunately, the gun was not found. When questioned by the police later, Ramsey, Skyers, Cuffey, and Walker all alibied each other. They all said they were together with each other at one point. Therefore, Ramsey, Skyers, and Walker tie themselves to Patrick Cuffey. The investigation continues. Months go by. And in March of 2001, there was a shootout at Patrick Cuffey's house in his neighborhood. In that shootout, a known drug dealer was shot and killed. Many people were questioned. Cuffey was, of course, questioned, originally charged with some minor charges. And within 1 week of that shootout at Cuffey's house, the defendant directed a meeting of these four individuals, and all four of them were called to an attorney's office to find out whether they were going to crack, how they were holding up, because there was some scrutiny on Cuffey as a result of this new shootout. And the defendant, through his attorneys, wanted to make sure that they weren't going to give up SIDNEY DORSEY. Even wanted them to sign statements that Dorsey had nothing to do with the Derwin Brown assassination. The next night, there was a meeting at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Buckhead, called by a reporter with GQ magazine. Again, the four, Ramsey, Skyers, Cuffey, and Walker, were called to this meeting. Funny, isn't it, that these four were called to the meeting? And in that reporter's room was SIDNEY DORSEY. And he sent word down, and Patrick Cuffey went up to SIDNEY DORSEY's room. Dorsey again will make sure everything's okay. No one's about to break. Y'all aren't going to implicate me. Skyers made neither of the two meetings, but was invited to both. Cuffey, Walker, and Ramsey were at both those meetings. As a result of those charges, the charges that came out of the shooting incident at Cuffey's house, Cuffey's lawyer approached District Attorney J. Tom Morgan and told him that Cuffey had information about the assassination of Derwin Brown. Mr. Morgan said, if Cuffey were the trigger man, or if Cuffey were the instigator, don't even bring me the information because we're not going to cut a deal. And Cuffey's lawyer said, no, he wasn't the instigator and he wasn't the trigger man. And so Cuffey sat down and disclosed to Mr. Morgan, the other investigative team, and all those working on this case, how the plot was hatched, why the plot was hatched. And you will find that until Patrick Cuffey came forward, there was not a lot of evidence in place. But Patrick Cuffey's testimony and his statement to the police led to a lot of evidence that you will hear. Evidence connecting the corruption of the sheriff's department to the assassination. Now, you won't like Patrick Cuffey and you won't like the deal that was made for his testimony. But his statement and his cooperation led to the discovery of testimonial evidence, physical evidence, documentary evidence, ballistic evidence, and witnesses, all of whom you will hear from and see that will corroborate Cuffey's testimony. Cuffey's testimony and cooperation, in effect, was like a domino. And his cooperation led to more things and more things and more things. And it's all of these things upon which you will base your decision. We knew that we would need more than just Cuffey. And Paul Skyers was approached because Paul Skyers was the least culpable of the five. He was the wheelman. The most culpable, SIDNEY DORSEY, ordered it. The next most culpable, Melvin Walker, the trigger man. Can't make deals with these two. You can't. Ramsey was prepared with his .380 and was certainly more involved than the man who wouldn't take a gun with him. So we went to Skyers. Now remember, Cuffey came to us. We didn't pick Cuffey. Cuffey was picked by Dorsey years ago. The statements made by Skyers corroborated Cuffey, corroborated what took place. And as a result of their cooperation, neither of those two men will be prosecuted for the crimes they committed here in the state of Georgia. Now, the defense may scream that they're lying and they're only saying this to save their own hides, but you remember what I said about the domino effect of their cooperation, and you look at all of the other evidence that will support what happened. The evidence, ladies and gentlemen, like the school detective who heard from the defendant himself that Cuffey's okay, Cuffey's with me. Evidence such as a GBI agent who will come in and tell you that he found the parts of the Tech-9 that were used to assassinate Derwin Brown in the storm gutter where Paul Skyers said they were found. Evidence such as a security guard who worked for SID by the name of James Jordan. James Jordan will tell you that in February of 2001, after the assassination of Derwin Brown, SIDNEY DORSEY, Patrick Cuffey, and Melvin Walker all came to a location in Dekalb County where Jordan was working. He knew Dorsey because he worked for him. He knew Cuffey because he worked with him. He had never met Melvin Walker, but he will tell you that the two of them introduced Melvin Walker to him that night. And they sat and had a conversation. They even talked about the investigation. And the reactions of Cuffey and Dorsey will be interesting. But he will tell you that the four of them, Walker, Cuffey, Dorsey, and Jordan, talked for about 4 or 5 minutes together, and then these three went off together and huddled up after the assassination. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will also be that there was a trial in Dekalb County and that Ramsey and Walker were acquitted of charges relating to the assassination of Derwin Brown in that trial. The evidence will be, however, that the Dekalb County trial against Ramsey and Walker were for different charges. There was different evidence. There were different defendants, and there's a different motive. Corruption was not a part of their trial that provides the motive for the assassination. Ladies and gentlemen, those charges did not include the underlying reason for SIDNEY DORSEY ordering the assassination of Derwin Brown, and that was his inability to lose the power that he had gained through the office. All of this evidence points to one man. All of this evidence points to one man who directed the assassination of Derwin Brown, a decorated police officer, loving family man, intent on cleaning up the corruption in DeKalb County. SIDNEY DORSEY did this because he could not stand to lose his power. And at the close of the state's evidence, we will come back before you and ask you to return the only verdict that speaks the truth, and that is a verdict of guilty on all counts. Thank you.
Child, I got stuck in limbo. I was trying to talk to y'all. Hey, BA said, girl, you, no problem. But baby, you just missed a whole hell of a lot. So we are doing the first night, part 1 of the state of Georgia versus SIDNEY DORSEY. This is a flashback of a legendary trial that took place in 2002. Where the state of Georgia is trying a sheriff, SIDNEY DORSEY, for a plethora of things, okay? They got him on a RICO, which I don't understand that one, but the RICO part was where the state was able to charge him with all the corruption. He was having people drive his kids. He was having people work for a security company. He was having affairs with the cops. He hired his own. He did a lot of corrupt activities. To put it that way, I could be here all night talking about everything this man did illegally as a sheriff. Okay. Now, beyond the scale and the scope of that, the second part, the most important, the most grievous charge is murder for hire, murder. So the sheriff, the good old Sheriff Dorsey, you know, he had his run, his power control, his ego trip, his narcissism running rampant, okay, on the Dekalb County. And he lost, somebody dared to challenge him for the position of sheriff. That would be Derwin Brown. He lost the election in a runoff. So not to be undone, it's alleged that SIDNEY DORSEY did this huge murder for hire. I don't know why he thought he would be able to get away with this whole deal. In just the opening statements, how many people did he include in on his murder to hire? He had his right-hand man, Cuffy. Cuffy brought in 3 other people. So it was 4 different people that were supposed to pull off this hit, which they did kill unalive Derwin by shooting him in his driveway with his kids in the house and his wife in the house right before Christmas and on the day of her birthday. She had to find her husband dead in the driveway. He did all this to get that man out the way who had rightfully won the position of sheriff in order to attempt to get back into the sheriff's position. Now, I think he also did it too, because once he left out of office, what's the chances that everything that he had been doing in office would come to light? This man was doing a lot. Okay, and his wife is sitting there in court and have to hear about all these other women and everything. But I mean, think about the arrogance to even sit there and tell he already got the 4 people involved in it. They're supposed to pull it off, right? And then he tells another man, the deputy, the old man, he tells him, oh, don't worry, he'll never make it to office. Then he tells the woman, the very woman who he was pretty much extorting, having an affair with, and at the same time getting her to pay money in order to have her bonds company, he literally tells her about it. Then he goes to several pastors and tell him, you know, it's just like, to me, the way he was carrying this out screams that he absolutely felt he was untouchable. Untouchable. Why else would you have so much arrogance and be so just open with it, right? So it's going to be very interesting to hear how the defense is going to counteract all what we just heard. Let me rewind this here. Thank you guys for joining me again on Trial Watch with Demetria Night Court on this flashback trial, 2002. Who shot the sheriff? Now we're finna hear from the defense. And Renee say, child, I have been listening and this man was doing too much. Sean P say he was doing the absolute most, okay? Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, one thing I want to ask y'all, what y'all think? Y'all saw how the camera kept going on him, right? Which he is super duper fly with that perm, period. He was doing too much talking. And all that talking, to me, all I heard was arrogance and ego. Ego, arrogance, pride. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if those are the part of the 7 deadly sins. I had to look it up. I know pride is, right? But this is just, I think when the camera kept showing his face and he was sitting there listening intently and looking crazy, I said to myself, I bet you anything that he is literally sitting there listening to all this descriptors of what he's done. And instead of saying like, damn, I bet you he was sitting there listening to that shit and thinking, damn, that's where I messed up. That's where I messed up. I should have done this instead, you know, and blaming all the people, his flunkies. I bet you anything he was sitting there saying that is all their fault, not his. Let's go on and to the defense. Do I have it on share? I don't have it on share. Let me share my screen. Thank you guys for joining me. Don't forget to hit the like. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. And absolutely don't forget to support this growing channel and this content. Thank y'all. Let's see.
45.
What?
5-year-old SIDNEY DORSEY.
Hold on. Let's start.
January 1945. 5-year-old SIDNEY DORSEY was put on a train by his parents in Brooklyn, New York, bound for Decatur, Georgia, Dekalb County. SIDNEY was raised by his aunt. And in Georgia in the 1940s, a child who did not live with their parents could not attend public school. So SIDNEY was forced to attend private school. Finances were at issue. And since the age of 7, SIDNEY has worked to earn money for himself and his family. In school, he cleaned the toilets at the school he attended in exchange for his tuition. In 1959, after graduating from high school, SIDNEY did a very honorable thing. He joined our armed forces, the Army. He was stationed mostly in Germany, and after being honorably discharged, SIDNEY continued his civic service. In 1964, joining the City of Atlanta Police Department. For the next 28 years, SIDNEY served as a decorated officer. He completed college and law school while attending and being an employee of the City of Atlanta Police Department, commendations up and down his chest. He solved the horrible murder of the Honorable Federal Judge Horace Ward's wife, federal judge who desegregated the University of Georgia. He was a case agent, lead case agent, on the infamous murder of Atlanta missing children cases in the early 1980s. He solved 5 murders within a week period of time and was nominated Employee and Officer of the Year. There was SIDNEY DORSEY Day, celebrated by the City of Atlanta Council. When SIDNEY retired from the City of Atlanta Police Department in 1992, full benefits, full pension, with honors, he dedicated full time to his family and his business. At that time, SIDNEY was married, he still is, to Miss Sherry Dorsey. And they had a child 2 years old in 1992 named Justin. SIDNEY was also a great businessman. He had a company called SID, Security Investigation Division. And what that company did was, at times, places like banks wanted an armed guard by at all times. The police weren't going to provide that service. So every moment that the bank is open in bad areas, the bank wanted somebody standing by with an armed guard, and that's the type of service that SID provided. Also, there are very good people who are living in high crime areas in Atlanta. And there's apartment complexes. And the apartment complexes hired SID to have people, they're armed security guards, patrolling the area so that the people who live in the apartments can live a peaceful, normal life without being in fear. In 1996, it's November of 96, SIDNEY DORSEY ran for and was elected the first African-American sheriff in Dekalb County's history. November 1996, when SIDNEY was elected, was the 3rd time that SIDNEY ran for sheriff. 1992, he ran unsuccessfully. November 95, and earlier in 96, he won the election in November 96. And like most politicians do, you will learn from the course of this trial, it may be distasteful. SIDNEY DORSEY rewarded people who worked hard on his campaign. He gave them jobs. One of those persons is a man named Mr. Patrick Cuffey. SIDNEY has known Patrick Cuffey since 1991. Patrick Cuffey was falling through life. He got arrested. All the charges are dropped except the misdemeanor, but he'd always get in trouble. And Patrick Cuffey would come to SIDNEY and say, you know, I'm from St. Croix. I wasn't raised by my parents. I have an accent. I'm African American. And SIDNEY, you'll learn this through the trial, tried to help people who were down on their luck. He also saw in Patrick Cuffey goodness. You will learn that Patrick Cuffey is very smart, very hardworking, unbelievably good dresser, always in uniform, is crisp, always polite, has a good demeanor. SIDNEY wanted Patrick Cuffey to succeed. On SIDNEY's successful campaign for sheriff, Patrick Cuffey worked hard. He's called a grunt. It's a typical term used in Atlanta for people who help out on campaigns. But a grunt is the person who has the hardest job. In the hot sun, they go door to door in the county, knocking on the door, asking the people who live there, can I put this sign, vote for SIDNEY DORSEY, Sheriff, Dekalb County, in your yard? Here's a pamphlet about SIDNEY DORSEY. Read what he has done and what he'll do. Patrick Cuffey worked so hard on the campaign that SIDNEY DORSEY, when elected, rewarded him with a job. SIDNEY's done this with other people too. You'll see number names. And SIDNEY made Patrick Cuffey a detention officer. $40,000 a year salary. With overtime, Patrick Cuffey's hardworking. He earned every dime of overtime. He was making $100,000 a year. Prior to this, Patrick Cuffey never made more than $15,000 a year. But you will learn that Patrick Cuffey was a disgruntled employee. He was mad at SIDNEY DORSEY. You will learn that Patrick Cuffey didn't want to be a detention officer. He expected to come into the sheriff's department and police the police. He wanted to be the chief investigator for internal affairs of the Dekalb County Sheriff's Department. They employ almost 1,000 people. And what internal affairs does is if there's an allegation of police or sheriff employee misconduct, that is investigated by the Internal Affairs Division. There's power in that position. You're over all employees. But Patrick Cuffey had absolutely no experience at that type of position. The most he was a private security guard for SID. You will learn that there are ranks in the sheriff's department. Detention officer, sheriff deputy, sergeants, captains, lieutenants, majors, colonels, chief, and the sheriff. Patrick Cuffey was at the lowest rung, and he was mad. He had all these people above him. Every supervisor was above him and giving him a hard time. In April of 2000, it was time for the re-election effort to get underway. SIDNEY wanted to be re-elected sheriff. And he had a lot of people working for him. But nobody wanted to do the grunt work. They all wanted to make phone calls, answer the phones. So SIDNEY went and met with Patrick Cuffey. And he said, I need you to be a grunt. It was beautiful what you did before. Let's do it again. Put your same team together and get out there and go get them. I want signs up everywhere in the county, just like you did before. And Patrick Cuffey said, no way. You have wronged me. I don't care if you win or lose. You keep me down. I'm a detention officer inside the jail. That's the worst position that you can give. There are 5 areas of work in the sheriff's department. The jail is where you are around all the inmates. People, unfortunately, come in who get arrested sometimes with diseases. Sometimes they fight with you. It is not the place most people want to work. There's the administration side. That's where the sheriff's office is. All the paper comes through there. Big offices, windows, great place to work. The court services, just like the honorable sheriff deputy who's standing to my right, every courthouse has them. It's a great place to work. You work alongside great people like the Honorable Judge Becker. Field division, where you're outside, you're mingling with people, you're giving tickets, you're doing parades. And the community service, that's where you really interact. The children want somebody to come to their class. You speak at their class. The Super Bowl comes to Atlanta. You'd help provide security and watch the Super Bowl. Patrick Cuffey was the lowest rung in the jail, and he told SIDNEY DORSEY he will not help. You're on your own with this election. And SIDNEY DORSEY, unbeknownst to him, entered an agreement with Patrick Cuffey that would seal the fate of Derwin Brown.
I still love to surf, snowboard, and of course skate. So I do know magnesium to support my muscle and bone health. Cuno's high absorption magnesium glycinate helps me get the full benefit.
We didn't have no commercial on the last one. My bad, can't get no premium on here. Well, somebody might need some turmeric. There you go. But this ain't working. All right, back to action.
The end of April of 2000, okay. Sydney Dorsey told Patrick Cuffey, if you work hard like you did last time and you get all the signs up, pass out all of those pamphlets, I will give you a supervisor position. You'll work in community relations. You'll be promoted. The team that you assemble, you let me know who they are. And if they work for the Sheriff's Department now, I will give them, inside the Sheriff's Department, I will give them a job. The next day, Patrick Cuffey went to his brother. He calls him his brother, his best friend. They're not related. Brother. His name is Paul Skyers. And told Paul Skyers, if we work as grunts for this re-election campaign, you're going to get a job. You will learn, ladies and gentlemen, that Paul Skyers' lifelong dream was to work for the Sheriff's Department of Dekalb County. He loved the uniform and the power that he perceived it brought. He also, Paul Skyers, believed he'll make $40,000 a year salary, like his best friend Patrick Cuffey, and with overtime be making $100,000 a year. That's a lot of money to anyone. It's extraordinary money to Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers. And Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers, in May of 2000, these dates are critical, concocted a plot to rig the election for sheriff. They took out an insurance plan to ensure that Cuffey and Skyers would not be taken away from their lifelong dreams and a lot of money. Cuffey and Skyers decided that whoever dared to defeat Sydney Dorsey in the August election, this is May now, would be slayed. On May 4th of 2000, Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers are purchasing parts to this murder weapon. In June and July of 2000, before the Honorable Mr. Hodges' supposed birth of the murder plot, he says it's around September 2000. In June and July of 2000, Cuffey and Skyers are watching every move Derwin Brown makes. Derwin Brown would get up and leave his home in the morning. They'd follow him. They want to know, who is Derwin Brown with? Does he carry a weapon? Where does he go? They watch him throughout the day. Go campaigning, go to his campaign office. At night when Derwin Brown would come home, Cuffey and Skyers are watching him. What neighbors walk their dogs during this hour? Does he have people around him? What kind of cars does he have access to? What type of people is he associating with? In July of 2000, Cuffey and Skyers seek out a second murder weapon. The reason they chose to buy parts for this murder weapon is it's untraceable. You will look at it, this is a replica, but you will look at it and learn that every gun, like a house, has a serial number or a deed in a house, and it's registered. So if you lawfully purchase a gun, that serial number is on a computer that's accessed throughout the world, and everybody would know that that gun is in your possession. Well, the guns that Cuffey and Skyers look for were untraceable. They were stolen, serial numbers removed. In July of 2000, Cuffey and Skyers are looking for a second murder weapon, a backup murder weapon. They want to be sure that their jobs and promotions go through. So they met with Jared Richardson. He's a good man. He's a former law enforcement officer with Fulton County Sheriff's Department, a bright man. And Patrick Cuffey manipulated him. And Patrick Cuffey told Mr. Richardson, I need a gun. I want to go out and do some things with the Boy Scouts because I'm involved with the Boy Scouts. But the gun can't be traceable. This is July of 2000, 2 months before the prosecution's theory that SIDNEY Dorsey asked for Derwin Brown to be murdered. This is not the first time that Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers have concocted this murderous plot. In March of 1996, the sheriff of DeKalb County was a good man named Mr. Bob Morris. And Bob Morris defeated SIDNEY Dorsey at the polls. And Cuffey and Skyers sought out Bob Morris. They watched his home as he'd come and go. Who came to his home? What kind of cars was he using? Who was he with? Thankfully, Cuffey and Skyers did not assassinate Sheriff Bob Morris. Unfortunately for all of us, they carried out their killing on Derwin Brown. On Friday, December 15th of 2000, Derwin Brown was celebrating with his family and close personal friends at a restaurant bar in Decatur, Georgia, called the MVP Club. Derwin Brown had graduated earlier that day from the Sheriff-elect Academy School. While he's celebrating in the back room, Cuffey and Skyers are watching. They want to know, who is Derwin Brown with? What kind of car is he driving tonight? What time will he leave? Does he have a weapon visible? Cuffey and Skyers are also watching Derwin Brown's house. They want to know, was there a car accident in the area so that the police are out assisting the persons in a car accident? Was there a pipe that burst so that Georgia Power is out trying to help fix the problem? Who's having a party on the block? Anybody have any dogs that are loose?
I still love to surf, snowboard, and of course skate. So I take Cuno Magnesium to support my muscle and bone health. Cuno's high absorption magnesium glycinate helps me get.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry about these commercials. This is on Court TV website.
Cuno, the brand I.
This is on Court TV website, and they don't have premium. Otherwise, I would have it. So anywho, yes, I think he being very, very, very stereotypical and making references to black. And you already knew. Oh, damn! Every time I get in my jush, let me see. I bet he look at this now and say, "Oh."
That evening, December 15th, 2000, Cuffey and Skyers sat in a 1990 dark green Honda Accord with rectangular taillights, waiting for their prey to arrive. At 11:20, the Honorable Derwin Brown in a rental car pulled up in front of his home. The skies were open, pouring rain. Derwin Brown retrieved packages from his car. They're from Old Navy, holding a dozen roses in his hands. It was his wife's birthday. And he was going into his home to continue the celebration with his family and his friends. The rain didn't bother Derwin Brown, and he had a big smile on his face as he approached his house, Christmas lights shining like beacons. Suddenly, Paul Skyers came running from the darkness, his right hand outstretched, and fired 16 times at the Honorable Derwin Brown. As Derwin Brown tried to run away, get to safety, Skyers continued pursuit. Striking Derwin Brown 12 times. From his toes, to his knees, to his private parts, to his chest, to his throat. As Derwin Brown lay, a puddle of blood, screaming his last screams, Paul Skyers ran down that driveway, ran around that dark green Honda, opened the passenger side door, got in with Patrick Cuffey driving, and the two of them fled into the darkness. They were destroying the evidence, taking apart the gun, throwing it all over Atlanta, Georgia, getting rid of the clothing that they wore. As a 911 call rang out that Sheriff-elect Derwin Brown had been shot in his front yard, the police pounced on the scene like bees to honey. Immediately, the police grouped up, stopped every person coming into this neighborhood or leaving the neighborhood. Who are you? What are you doing here? Who are you with? What did you see? What did you hear? Every home in that neighborhood, wake up. If you're up, answer the door. What did you see? What did you hear? What do you know about this tragedy? Within an hour, the police had obtained an eyewitness statement. It's a 10-year-old girl. Her name is Shantia Goodson. And Miss Goodson lives right next door to where Derwin Brown lives. And she was in her bedroom. And you'll see photographs that the police took, beautiful. Looking out her bedroom window, it's a perfect view of Derwin Brown's driveway, where he was first shot, and the street that lay in front of the home that dark green car with the rectangular taillights took off into the darkness. And Miss Goodson told the police, I was awake. There were 10 people in my home. 2 other people in the room with me. There's no evidence, there's going to be no evidence that she was asleep. She's clearly awake. And I was looking out the window, and I recognized Derwin Brown as my neighbor. I saw him walk up the driveway. Suddenly, I heard shots. A man, light-skinned, African-American, 5'7" tall, light-skinned, ran down the driveway. Ran around a dark car that was parked just further up from Derwin Brown's home. I saw the door open, but no dome light came on on the inside of the car. Person got in the front passenger seat and the car drove off, and I saw that it had rectangular taillights. Paul Skyers, light-skinned African-American man, about 5'7". The police used great instincts. Phenomenal job. And the police had known that Patrick Cuffey was under investigation for jacking up, that's the word used, his overtime while employed at the sheriff's department. The police didn't understand how could a gentleman who makes $40,000 a year be taking home $100,000 a year? That's 2.5 times his salary in overtime. The police also knew that just 9 days earlier, on December 6th of 2000, Derwin Brown signed a letter addressed to Patrick Cuffey, telling Patrick Cuffey he was fired come January 1st, 2001. So the police set up a surveillance outside of Patrick Cuffey's home at 2:30 in the morning on December 16th, 2000, Saturday, 3 hours after Derwin Brown has unfortunately passed. And the police are watching Patrick Cuffey's home. And at 3 o'clock that morning, there came a 1990 dark color green Honda Accord. It had rectangular taillights. And the car came into the cul-de-sac where Patrick Cuffey lives, in a cul-de-sac, and parked right in front of Patrick Cuffey's home. And Patrick Cuffey exited that vehicle. To this day, Patrick Cuffey denies driving that dark-colored car with the rectangular taillights on the night that Derwin Brown was murdered. You will hear from the police officers that saw Patrick Cuffey get out of that car. They were using night vision glasses. There's no mistake. January 1st of 2001, SIDNEY Dorsey turned over the office of the sheriff to a great man. His name is Thomas Edison Brown. He's the current sheriff of Dekalb County, no relation by blood to the Honorable Derwin Brown. And the first thing that Sheriff Thomas Brown did was tell Patrick Cuffey, "You are fired." He wrote the resignation or termination letter, and it said, "For the potential abuse of overtime, you cannot work here." Patrick Cuffey has now gone from a $100,000 job to unemployed, zero income. So Patrick Cuffey, being in the mindset he's in at this time, does what he does. He decides, I'm going to be a drug dealer. So Patrick Cuffey gets together with his friends, and he's involved in the drug trade, marijuana, 10 pounds. But Patrick Cuffey's friend, a man named Jeffrey Nigel George, took Patrick Cuffey's money and didn't give him marijuana. So on March 18th, 2001, Jeffrey Nigel George came to Patrick Cuffey's home and was beaten within an inch of his life on the front yard of Patrick Cuffey. Jeffrey Nigel George was then picked up, thrown into the truck, driven a mile away, and had bullets blasted into his brain. Police came out, interviewed Patrick Cuffey. Patrick Cuffey put on his very good demeanor, manipulation. He's a master. And told the police, I don't know what happened. It was in my front yard, and some white people came by and just started to fire. I don't know anybody involved. I'm of no color. The police worked the case hard. It took them months But finally, on September 12th, 2001, the day after the tragedy in our nation, Patrick Cuffey was arrested and charged with murder of Jeffrey Nigel George that carries a life in prison sentence. You serve the rest of your life in prison. He was charged with felony murder of Mr. Jeffrey Nigel George. That also carries the rest of Patrick Cuffey's life in prison. Patrick Cuffey was indicted and charged with kidnapping with serious bodily injury. That also carries Patrick Cuffey spending the rest of his life in prison. Tampering with evidence, it's a misdemeanor, carries a maximum of 12 months in jail. And 2 counts of lying to the police. Patrick Cuffey is now charged with very serious crimes. And he didn't want a jury like you to decide his fate. Instead, he concocted the story that lands SIDNEY DORSEY standing before you. Patrick Cuffey was visited while he's in jail constantly by his friend, his brother, Paul Skyers. They had constant phone conversations. And Cuffey and Skyers knew in March of 2001, 7 months before Patrick Cuffey's arrested for the murder of Jeffrey Nigel George and the kidnapping. In March of 2001, Cuffey and Skyers knew, they were told by the authorities, that's the police, that if they have any information on the murder of Derwin Brown, they will be granted immunity. That means never held responsible, not a second in jail, given a free pass, not prosecuted, if they implicate the former sheriff of Dekalb County, SIDNEY DORSEY. That was in March of 2001.
Skating for over 45 years has taken a toll on my body. I take Cuno.
Thank you for joining. If you're up top and not in the chat, please be sure to hit the like and to subscribe to this new channel, Trial Watch with Demetri. We'll be taking a flashback look at a notorious trial from 2002, state of Georgia versus SIDNEY DORSEY. He was a sheriff. He's been accused of grand corruption, as well as being the leader, the plotter, the mastermind behind a murder hired to murder. How you say that?
The following agreement was reached with the Honorable J. Tom Morgan and Patrick Cuffey. All charges in the indictment in the Jeffrey Nigel George case, murder, felony murder, kidnapping with serious bodily injury, aggravated assault, and lying to police, 2 counts, will be dismissed. They'll go away, Mr. Cuffey. In fact, your record of the arrests, that'll be gone away too. It's called expunged. We're going to clear your record of that arrest. You must, though, enter a guilty plea to tampering with evidence. It's a misdemeanor. It's 12 months in jail, maximum. Additionally, for the murder of Derwin Brown, Mr. Cuffey, you, your best friend Paul Skyers, and your fiancée, Ms. Charlene Francis, will never be charged. Your role in that murder will never be charged. You will be granted immunity. And so will Mr. Skyers and your fiancée, Ms. Francis. If, first, you are not the shooter of Derwin Brown, and 2, you are not the instigator, the person who asked for Derwin Brown to die. Later that night, November 29th, 2000, there was an arrest warrant signed for the murder of Derwin Brown in the name to arrest Sidney Dorsey. The former sheriff of Dekalb County is now charged with murdering Derwin Brown. The sheriff is the highest law enforcement officer in any county. He's over everybody. He's the lead officer. And later that night, Sidney Dorsey did what he is trained to do. He turned himself in voluntarily to the police that just a year earlier, he was their supervisor. Sidney Dorsey sits before you for 4 reasons. First, Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers. The prosecution will tell you that there's this affinity, this association between Sidney Dorsey, Patrick Cuffey, and Paul Skyers. They were promised jobs in the sheriff's department for their agreement to murder Derwin Brown. You will learn it's going to be unequivocal. The promises of jobs, the promotion of Patrick Cuffey, that all was promised during the campaign. There'll be no doubt. Paul Skyers was promised the job during the campaign, not like the prosecution's telling me. That was in exchange for doing grunt work. Patrick Cuffey will tell you that the order to murder Derwin Brown came out around September of 2000, and it went like this. Patrick Cuffey got a phone call from Sidney Dorsey, come to my home. When Patrick Cuffey arrived, Sidney Dorsey said, go out on the porch, I'll be right there. And Sidney Dorsey came onto the porch, it's in the evening, and handed Patrick Cuffey a note on yellow 8.5 by 11 paper that said, kill Derwin Brown. And Patrick Cuffey looked at the note and handed it back to Sidney Dorsey, and Sidney Dorsey crumpled up the note and ate it. That's how Patrick Cuffey states that he was asked to murder Derwin Brown. Paul Skyers tells a different story. He says, I got a phone call from Sidney Dorsey. Come to my house, Mr. Skyers. And when Paul Skyers arrives, there's Patrick Cuffey. And Patrick Cuffey and Paul Skyers are asked by Sidney Dorsey, go out on the porch. And while on the porch, Sidney Dorsey takes out a yellow piece of paper and a pen, and he writes on the pen the note, kill Derwin Brown. And at that point, everyone agreed, and in symbolism, to show their unity, the note was ripped in 3. And Paul Skyers ate his part of the note. And then Patrick Cuffey, in front of everyone, ate his part of the note. And then Sidney Dorsey ate his part of the note. All joining the union of murder. They are diametrically opposed stories because it never happened. Cuffey and Skyers will tell you that they started to get the murder weapons after September 2000. You will see receipts that they're buying parts to the untraceable Tech 9 semi-automatic murder weapon in May 4th of 2000, 4 months before. Cuffey and Skyers deny ever following, ever doing any surveillance on Derwin Brown during his campaign. Campaign ended on August 8th of 2000. Cuffey and Skyers state that until September, we never did follow Derwin Brown. We never surveilled him. Derwin Brown would speak from his grave. He told people, I'm being followed during the election by Patrick Cuffey. Cuffey and Skyers are not truthful. Cuffey and Skyers deny ever being at the MVP Club on December 15th of 2000. They say we were never there. We didn't know Derwin Brown was going to be there. you will learn that people saw and identified Paul Skyers as being inside the MVP club on December 15th of 2000 while Derwin Brown was in the back with his family and friends. One person has known Paul Skyers for 8 years and said he was absolutely there. The police got this information out within days of the murder.
Skating for over 45 years has taken a toll on my body. I take Cunol turmeric because it helps with healthy joints and inflammation support.
We just gonna have to put up with this. I'm not gonna, obviously this was gonna be the course, part for the course for these commercials. So hey, my apologies in advance. Welcome, Sticks Girl. Welcome, not Tracy. Welcome, Lou. Welcome, T's Lounge. Lady T. I put on the screen what the trial was about. Hopefully I'll cart that. This is the prosecution's opening statement.
Cuffey and Skyers deny ever going around Derwin Brown's neighborhood on the night that they murdered him until they actually got there. You will learn that they were in his neighborhood watching his home hours before they killed Derwin Brown. Cuffey and Skyers deny using that 1990 Honda, dark-colored with the rectangular taillights the night of the murder. They deny it. They say Paul Skyers' car is a car used as a getaway car. That is not true. You will learn that when the officers who were doing surveillance on Patrick Cuffey's home saw Patrick Cuffey get out of his car at 3 o'clock that morning, the dome light didn't come on when the door was open and Patrick Cuffey got out of that car. The 10-year-old gave a description that the dome light didn't come on in the car when she saw the 5'7" African-American light-skinned male run down Derwin Brown's driveway and get into that car and drive away with the rectangular taillights. Ms. Goodson also will tell you there was one person running from Derwin Brown's driveway. Patrick Cuffey has 3 people running from Derwin Brown's driveway, and Patrick Cuffey will tell you eventually when he comes that he saw Derwin Brown get shot and fall immediately. That is going to be impossible. You'll hear from the Honorable Dr. Gerald Goward. He's the best medical examiner in the country. He will tell you there's no way that Derwin Brown was shot and dropped. He was running for his life. That's because Patrick Cuffey was in the getaway car inching up in front of where the murder's occurring, so he didn't see how the murder occurred. Cuffey and Skyers wanted their prestigious jobs and their income. They murdered Derwin Brown, not Sidney. They are not truthful. The second reason Sidney sits here is Mr. Clarence Mosley. He's a good man, African-American man. He's in his 70s. And Clarence Mosley came to Sidney shortly after Sidney lost the election on August 8th of 2000 and said, "What are you going to do now?" Everybody's asking that question to Sidney. They'd ask any elected official who has just lost his job. And Sidney said, "It's not over yet. Clarence, it's not over yet." And Clarence Mosley is hard of hearing. So Sidney said, "Derwin Brown will never assume the office of the sheriff. There will be a special election. I will enter it and I will win." Clarence Mosley left the office. He will tell you that SIDNEY DORSEY had no anger in his voice, was not acting strange when he said this. But the day after the killing of Derwin Brown, Mr. Mosley, being a good citizen, what all of us would do, went to his friend, the current sheriff, Thomas Brown, and said, "You know, 5 months ago, I was in Sidney's office, and he told me this, and I just want to make it known." You will learn that right after Sidney lost the election, he got a lot of calls and visitors, powerful people in Dekalb County, the heads of churches, other politicians, other people who work on political campaigns, other elected officials. And they said, you know, Sidney, you lost this election in an odd manner. The primary election, which was July 18th of 2000, you got 49% of the vote. If you had another percentage point, 320 votes, there wouldn't be a runoff. Derwin Brown achieved 25% of the vote. And then this media hit about unnamed corruption, supposed corruption, and it inverted. And Derwin Brown on August 8th of 2000 beat you at the polls. We don't know if that was fair. So what we want to do is this. We want to educate the voters again. When they go to the polls in November, that's the general election, they will see the ticket. And it'll say for Sheriff of Dekalb County, one name, Derwin Brown, but there'll be a space there. And we are going to raise a special election, a write-in campaign. And we're going to have so many voters write in SIDNEY DORSEY that you'll have more votes than Derwin Brown, and you'll still be sheriff. That's the conversation that SIDNEY DORSEY had with Clarence Mosley. It had nothing about a confession or a dark heart. He explained, just like a lot of people knew, what was going on. The third reason is Miss Shirley McMichael. Miss McMichael is a bondsperson in Dekalb County. She's the first African-American bondsperson ever in the county history, and SIDNEY DORSEY gave her that right. The sheriff of a county, any county, has the ability to dictate and state who can sign bonds. It's big business. And unless the sheriff gives you approval, you can't be a bondsperson. And a bonds people make a lot of money in Dekalb County. They usually make a lot of money wherever they are, but Dekalb County is a large jail. And the way it would work is a person would go into custody, get arrested, and the court would set a bond, $20,000, for example. And the person who wants to get that member of their family out of jail would go to a bondsperson potentially and say, here's $2,500. Would you go in and sign my loved one out of jail? And the person would be released on bond, awaiting his trial or his case. Shirley McMichael was grossing $600,000 a year at the bonding company. You will learn that when Shirley McMichael came to interview with Sidney to be a bondsperson, she wore a very short skirt. She sat down in a chair. She opened her legs, exposing her private parts. For the next 4 years, Sidney and Shirley McMichael had a consensual sexual relationship. You will learn that Sidney, although married to Sherry Dorsey, they slept in different rooms. They stayed together for their young son. Shirley McMichael would tell everybody how wonderful Sidney was. You're going to hear from judges working at the jail, other sheriff's department employees, just brag about how wonderful Sidney is. Ms. McMichael is now claiming that she's been raped for 4 years by Sidney and forced to pay him money. It's not true. You will hear stories of how there was a birthday party held for Sidney Dorsey. 500 people attend. And Ms. McMichael isn't only in attendance, she's a participant. There's a big fishbowl, and the men who want to do it can throw their business cards or their names in a little fishbowl, or a big fishbowl. At the end of the night, one name is pulled out, and that's the lucky winner. The one night in a limousine with a date. Shirley McMichael, she volunteered for that. Shirley McMichael, mother lives in Ohio. And at times, her mother, her name's Miss Tabor, would come into Georgia and visit with her daughter and her grandchildren. And she loves to cook. And on one occasion, Shirley McMichael invited Sidney over to eat and meet her mother. Shirley McMichael brought her mother to a different birthday party held for Sidney. And when everyone was standing up when Sidney walked in, there was a line waiting for people to shake Sidney's hand. Good to see you, Sheriff. Wish you well. And Shirley McMichael and her mother wait on that line. You do not introduce your mother to your rapist. Shirley McMichael has a good friend. It's in Buckhead, that's in Atlanta, Georgia. And he owns the Uptown Comedy Club. And Shirley McMichael said to that person, can I host a fundraiser for my good friend, SIDNEY DORSEY here? And the owner, thinking it would be good for business, will attract a lot of people know about my club, said sure. And Shirley McMichael came dressed to the nines. The whole time during the fundraiser, holding on to SIDNEY DORSEY, saying, it's my good friend. Shirley McMichael campaigned for SIDNEY DORSEY in the 2000 election against Derwin Brown. She was working the polls, holding signs, wearing t-shirts. She had her employees doing that too. But then SIDNEY DORSEY lost the election. And the Honorable Derwin Brown, as his right, sent out a proclamation. All current bonding companies under Sidney's administration must reapply. Nobody is safe. Shirley McMichael did not want to lose her lucrative bonding business. So she sat down with Derwin Brown. And Ms. McMichael said, Sheriff-elect Brown, you ran, you got elected on the platform of corruption under the watch of SIDNEY DORSEY. And I could help you out. You see, I know about corruption. For 4 years, SIDNEY DORSEY has forced me against my will to have sex with him. He's raped me. Because he told me if I didn't allow him to dirty me, I'd lose my company. Also, SIDNEY DORSEY over 4 years has taken approximately $20,000 from me. Just took it. Said it's a price of business. But I'll come forward and work with you if you allow me to keep my company.
Skating for over 45 years has taken a toll on my body. I take Cunol turmeric because it helps with healthy joints and inflammation support.
Every time somebody say for or no or hey, I'm gonna say they turned into a ghost, like that God said last week in that quickie trial. Now, every time somebody do that, I think about what that man said. I turned to the ghost and said, no. I hope y'all enjoying this first night of this epic or this legendary trial. Who shot the sheriff? I hope y'all keep coming back every night at 7 p.m. Central.
She's not truthful. The fourth and final reason Sidney stands here before you is this corruption. What is corruption? Corruption is criminal activity. Well, the authorities have the sheriff-elect homicide on their hands. And they formulated the largest police effort ever in Georgia's history to try to solve this homicide. Members of the FBI, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm, Internal Revenue Service, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the local DeKalb County District Attorney Office investigators, the DeKalb County Police Department, the DeKalb County Sheriff's Department, the DeKalb County Homicide Unit, and then a special task force was put on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to find any information that would help solve the murder of Derwin Brown. So the authorities said, you know, Derwin Brown ran that he's going to uncover corruption at the jail. So maybe if we could show that SIDNEY DORSEY was corrupt while sheriff, there'd be a motive that SIDNEY DORSEY would want Derwin Brown killed. So the authorities got together. And they interviewed every person to have a contract with the Sheriff's Department of DeKalb County while Sidney was the sheriff. It's big business. It's $51 million budget. The contracts include medicals. You have 2,800 inmates. Some of them never saw a doctor in their lives, and they're adults. They come into the jail, someone has to care for them. They're in the custody of the sheriff. That medical contract is worth millions. The telephones. A person housed in a county jail cannot just call like we do at home. You have to call collect. That contract is worth millions. Janitorial, cleaning service, maintenance. These are $1 million contracts. Every one of those people were spoken with by the authorities. Did Sidney Dorsey take money for you? Did he ask you for money? Did he ask you for sex? Did he do anything inappropriate? And the answer was no, not a thing. Every bonds person, there were 7 bonding companies in DeKalb County under Sidney's administration. Every one of them was spoken with. Did he ask for kickbacks? Did he take a bribe? Did he ask you for money? For the women, did he ask you for sex? Did he make that a quid pro quo of doing business? And the answer from everyone except Shirley McMichael, no, not a dime. The authorities undressed Sidney's personal finances, his pension plans, his IRAs, his checking account, the homes that he owns, his business, his personal life. Was he taking any big trips and paying in cash? Was he buying big ticket items like a house or a car? Any unexplained income? It's like a drug dealer. They're not working, yet they drive in a Lexus. That's unexplained income. Not a dime in unexplained income in Sidney Dorsey's life. What did the authorities find? This is what they found. Sidney Dorsey would send employees of his to banks. Sidney Dorsey family owned SID. Sidney wasn't running it, but he started. He resigned his position when he became sheriff, but he was helping them out. And sometimes the security guard did not come to the bank, and the bank then is not protected. So the bank employees would call Sidney and say, can you get someone over here? And Sidney would send a sheriff deputy. There were 55,000 hours of work done, 55,000 hours of work done at the banks by SID employees. 33 hours of what we're talking about that Sidney would send a sheriff's employee. 33 hours total. That's in 4 years of his administration. Driving family members. Sidney's young son named Justin went to school about 15 minutes from where the sheriff's office was. And he would send in the afternoon a sheriff's office employee to go pick up Justin and bring him back. Justin would do his homework at the sheriff's department, spend time with his father. Sidney's child broke down in Tennessee. It's Chattanooga. It's right over the border from where Georgia and Tennessee are. Sent the sheriff deputy employee to help her. Sherry Dorsey, sister, was stricken with cancer and died at the age of 35. She was distraught. She had to get up to see her sister and take care of her affairs. Sidney had a meeting with the Board of County Commissioners. Sidney asked a sheriff deputy to drive her. Sidney went on a family vacation. New York. But in Walt Disney World, you will learn that he was driven up by a sheriff's employee. You will learn about all of this, two things. Though it seems distasteful, you will learn that it's legal. The sheriff is a sheriff 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The employees work for the sheriff. SIDNEY DORSEY, when he took office, was told by his attorney, Ron Ramsey, these people work for you. Once the budget is given to the sheriff's office, it's your budget. Once you have these people here, you and only you, the sheriff, tells these employees what their duty is that day. No one else. You're going to see a proclamation, a reaffirmation written by attorney Ron Ramsey that says exactly that. SIDNEY was relying on the advice of a lawyer. In addition to that, SIDNEY was a rookie sheriff. He didn't know what to do. He was a homicide detective for almost 28 years, and then he ran a lucrative but small company, SID. It's a mom and pop shop. Now he's employing 1,000 people, and he looked to others to tell him what to do. He had aides, and they told SIDNEY, these people work for you. You can take the gas, the vehicle, and the employee because it helps you. While you're in New York on that drive, SIDNEY's on the phone. SIDNEY went to see the chief of police in New York. While you're in Walt Disney World, you're still the sheriff. If an emergency happens, we're going to call you. You got to come right back. Furthermore, what's critical is all this supposed corruption that was written on that board. Bank, use of banks, employees at the bank, driving family members around, legal work by Ron Ramsey. All of that was known to the district attorney's office in November of 2000. November of 2000, all of that was investigated. SIDNEY did nothing to obstruct that investigation, and he knew that was all known because, ladies and gentlemen, it was never hidden. It was common knowledge what SIDNEY was using these employees because he never perceived it to be a crime. There is no motivation for SIDNEY to be involved in the murder of Derwin Brown. In March of 2000, in Dekalb County, there was a trial. Melvin Walker went to trial. The state put up the same evidence. Melvin Walker was found not guilty of conspiring with SIDNEY DORSEY to murder Derwin Brown. Melvin Walker was found not guilty of being the murderer, the shooter of Derwin Brown. He was found not guilty of aggravated assault, not guilty of felony murder. He's home. David Ramsey went to trial. He was found not guilty of conspiring with SIDNEY DORSEY to assassinate Derwin Brown, not guilty of murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. He's home. He went to the islands, where he's from. SIDNEY DORSEY stands before you charged with the most serious crimes in the state of Georgia. Murder of a sheriff-elect, racketeering like the mafia, bribery, violation of oath of office, and thefts. SIDNEY is not guilty.
Boo, 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 boo. Now, I'm going to try my best as Judge D lit to not make any, I'm not going to come to any conclusions. We already know the man got found guilty. This is a flashback. Okay. So I think it's okay for me to be biased, but I am going to still keep an open mind and think about like what was the jury hearing and what they could possibly be thinking. I think when we do these flashback trials is with the point of really looking for the theatrics, looking for the lawyering, looking for explosive testimonies. That's what makes these trials legendary, right? So when we're looking back at it, that's what we're looking for. We know already that what the outcome is. This trial took place in 2002. We know he was found guilty. What you guys may not know is that after he actually got sentenced to prison, he finally confessed that he did do this like 3 or 4 years, maybe, don't quote me, into his sentence. So even though he kept saying not guilty all the way to the sentencing part, which we'll see later, eventually while doing the interview, he did admit his wrongdoing and the part he played. So I hope you guys are interested in this case. I am definitely. I think it was Tracy who said that this has been done many times on true crime shows, and it has, and I've seen it a couple of times, but I've never seen the trial. So I hope that you guys. Oh, dang. My bad, Lady Steph. Well, act like I didn't say that, okay? Act like I didn't say that, okay? My bad. I should have said spoiler alert, from 2002. So I hope you guys are going to be meeting me back here for night court. This is our flashback trial every night at 7 p.m. On tomorrow, we get into the testimonies. On tomorrow, we'll start putting up some polls and what have you. And we'll start keeping a running track of who the key players are. It's a lot of moving parts. And so you guys put in your thinking caps, put on your listening ears, and meet me back here tomorrow at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I will try my best to be on time for night court. Until we meet again. Oh, tomorrow, 10 a.m. This week, we're not doing a daytime trial. What we're doing all week on Trial Watch with Demetri for the daytime episodes is live reactions. Today, we did the Michael Jordan's son, Marcus Jordan, live reaction, his body cam arrest footage. If you have not seen that, go check it out on a replay. Please leave me a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are. And tomorrow, we're going to take a look back at, I think it was like a month or so ago, maybe 2 months, Karen Hooger, I think that's her name, Hooger from Real Life of Potomac. We're going to look at her DWI arrest body cam. Okay? You think, oh, no, I don't have a picture. I'm going to show you. Thank you. Come here, Paul. Come here, good boy. Come here. They want to see that baby. Oh, don't bite me. Stop. Let me fix your clothes on you. Hold on. Show him your mama's little man. Show him how cute you is. Hold on. Say, hey. You gotta learn how to be on TV, boy. Say, hey. Jury box. This is a little first shirt. It's a mama's little man. He looks so cute. And he got his first little collar. Let me see. I might have to show y'all. He's so furry. But a collar, I don't know if my son took his collar off. He got his first little collar. And today and yesterday, he started doing his first little leash training. He did good today. He's doing excellent with his crate training and using the potty. And he is really, really something terrible. For every bit that he is so cute, take all that cuteness and translate that into how bad he is. He is super duper bad. Him and Rock are playing like big boys, okay? Like literally, they up in here in a couple of months. I'm gonna have hell on my hand with them two house playing in this house. But Apollo, say hello. This is our one of our court mascots. So, see y'all on tomorrow, and I will be giving y'all updates on our mascot. Good night, everybody. Well, if that's the CC case, he got to be. If that's the case, he got to be a terror. He is a terror, and he knows what he's doing when he does stuff. Y'all want to hear him growl? Listen to him growl. Hold on. Here. You're not gonna do it. You're not gonna do it for him. Show him how bad you are. Growl. Yeah. Now he acting all sweet. Anywho, good night, everybody. See y'all in the morning for court. Hit the like on the way out. Good night.
Thanks for watching. Do not forget click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Like, comment and share. See you next time.